Okay, next lecture we are going to, hang on, go away. We are going to talk a little bit more about red blood cell formation, and we're also going to talk about red blood cell recycling in this particular lecture as well. So red blood cell formation is called erythropoiesis as opposed to hematopoiesis, which is a more general word describing to the formation of all of your different formed elements that you have in your blood. All right, so a little bit of a closer look at red blood cell formation. And again, some of the terminology here is a little bit different from what I showed you on that overview hematopoiesis diagram in the last video lecture. So the experts on hematopoiesis, I guess, don't completely agree on all of the cell names that they have. But here's a little bit of a closer look. So as we talked about on the last video lecture, you have hematopoietic stem cells in your bone marrow. Those are called hemocytoblasts. And then those can become partially specialized and become either myeloid stem cells or lymphoid stem cells. Okay, and so your red blood cells come from the myeloid stem cell type, and those become a committed cell that's called a pro-erythroblast. Pro like meaning before or first in this case, and then erythroblast. Remember, blast means an immature cell type, hasn't completely specialized yet. But now once you have these guys in the red bone marrow, they're not going to turn into anything but red blood cells. They have to go down the rest of the pathway that you see here, and that's why they're called committed cells. All right, however, there are multiple stages that these cells go through before they wind up over here looking like this as an erythrocyte. And that's what they're showing you here. No, you don't have to memorize the names of all of these cells in this pathway. Just be aware that there are different steps of this process that take place. Some of these names, like basophilic, that refers to a bluish dye that these cells take up if you stain them with that dye, and that's one of the things that the people who study tissues can use to help them identify these various cell types. Polychromatic would mean multicolored, etc. And notice here toward the end of the pathway, the cell, this orthochromatic erythroblast, punts out the nucleus. Remember, we said red blood cells don't have a nucleus inside them. And then they become these cells called reticulocytes, which still don't quite look like red blood cells, but these are the ones that enter the bloodstream over here. And then after about 2 days, they become the little biconcave, hemoglobin-filled discs that we call erythrocytes. All right, so some important terminology here. Erythropoiesis has to be very carefully regulated. You can't have too many red blood cells and you can't have too few. If you have too few, you will wind up with a very bad situation called tissue hypoxia. Hypoxia is a term that you guys should know. What do you think hypoxia means? Hypo, low, oxia, referring to oxygen gas. So that's low O2 concentrations in your tissues. And so you don't want that to happen. You don't want to starve your cells of oxygen gas. If it does happen, it can lead to what's called an infarction. And an infarction is where you have tissue death or necrosis. Necrosis is a term that's generally used for tissue death. Tissues are dying. That's necrosis, or they are necrotic. You might hear that term used. If that's due to a lack of oxygen gas, then that tissue death is called an infarction. We will hear that again in the next chapter when we learn about the heart, because if this happens in the heart, it's called a myocardial infarction. That's another name for a heart attack. That's what happens when people suffer those. It's due to the oxygen gas supply being cut off to a portion of the wall of the heart, and the heart can't beat as well due to that. All right, so you don't want too few red blood cells. If you have too many, if you guys remember on an earlier lecture, we said the red blood cells are the main thing that contributes to the blood's viscosity, or how thick it is. So you can't have too many Your blood would thicken, as you might imagine. Your blood cannot flow as quickly through your blood vessels if it's too thick, and that also is going to wind up cutting off oxygen supply to your tissues if your blood winds up being too thick. It would also raise your blood pressure. We'll learn about that when we cover blood pressure more so in Unit 3. Here's a pretty interesting statistic. Your red bone marrow is cranking out about 2 million red blood cells per second. If you guys remember some trivia on an earlier video lecture, at any given time you have many trillions of red blood cells, and they don't last forever. They live about 90 days and then they have to be replaced. So you're having to crank out lots of these constantly. So all that erythropoiesis is an ongoing process in your red bone marrow. All right, so you have to carefully control the numbers. So you have to get rid of old red blood cells. They have to be destroyed and broken down, and you've got to constantly be cranking out new ones. So this winds up being largely controlled through hormonal controls. There's a hormone whose name is abbreviated as EPO. We'll be talking about that shortly. That's the main one that controls these processes. Then you've also got to have adequate supplies of iron. Remember, you need iron in your heme. That's in your hemoglobin. You got to have plenty of amino acids in your diet. Why is that? Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And what did we say hemoglobin is? Hemoglobin is composed of 4 proteins or polypeptide chains that are linked together, and that makes up the main housing portion for those hemes that actually bind the oxygen gas. You need B vitamins as well. B vitamins are important for synthesis that goes on to make all these red blood cells. All right, a little bit more about this hormone we said that controls erythropoiesis. It's called EPO or erythropoietin. You might have heard of this in the news because there's been some controversy in the news about athletes taking this hormone as an illegal supplement to try to enhance their performance, and that is true. They do that at times. So this hormone is a signal that is sent to the red bone marrow, so the targets of this hormone are in your red bone marrow, and it stimulates increased erythropoiesis. So this hormone is going to cause you to increase your numbers of RBCs. Now, this is not a hormone that completely disappears. You're always going to have at least some of it in your bloodstream to help you maintain proper levels of RBCs, but at times you need to crank out more. All right, what actually stimulates secretion of this hormone, and where does it come from? It's actually produced, interestingly enough, by the kidneys. The liver also makes a little bit of it as well. And so you have cells in those tissues, and what they sense is hypoxia, lower O2 levels. When they sense that, lower O2 can be a signal, hey, there aren't enough red blood cells around delivering O2 gas, so we need to crank out some more. Or just by making more red blood cells, that's going to increase your amount of hemoglobin you have in your blood, which can bind more oxygen gas in your lungs and can transport more oxygen gas to your tissues. Okay, so then the kidneys mainly, and then also some from the liver, they secrete this hormone, travels to the red bone marrow where it stimulates more red blood cell formation. Interestingly, and you may have heard of this before, dialysis patients can have low red blood cell counts. And so what organ are dialysis patients having a problem with? The kidneys. So a lot of times people on dialysis have kidney damage, and so if those cells in the kidneys that make EPO are damaged, then they're going to have trouble cranking out enough red blood cells. Now, fortunately, EPO can be given artificially as a drug, though, to help counteract that. All right, so here's a diagram from your textbook, which is showing the homeostatic balance for normal blood oxygen levels that involves EPO. All right, so our stimulus, as we just talked about, in the kidneys, you have cells that stimulate low oxygen gas levels. Now that can be due to decreased RBCs, or it could be due to a decreased amount of hemoglobin. For example, let's say in your diet you're not getting enough amino acids. If you don't take in enough amino acids in your diet, you can't build proteins properly, and hemoglobin is primarily composed of proteins. So that would be another reason why you would have low O2 levels. Decreased availability of O2. For example, let's say, like we live here in Alabama, let's say you moved to a very high elevation somewhere, like say up at 15,000 feet, like you were down in South America in the Andes, and you're not adapted to that yet. That's another reason why you would be exposed to a decreased amount of oxygen gas. So a way to counteract any of these situations is to crank out more red blood cells. All right, so then your kidney and your liver secretes EPO. EPO travels to the red bone marrow. You increase your RBCs, and the more RBCs, these little bags of hemoglobin you have around, the more O2 they're going to be able to bind, and that is going to return your blood oxygen levels back to normal. So that's a pretty simple story there for blood oxygen level homeostasis. All right, so again, what can cause hypoxia, low O2? We just talked about some of those reasons. Another obvious one is, what if you're having a hemorrhage? So if you guys don't know that word, you should learn that. That's blood loss, a hemorrhage. So you have blood vessels that have been torn open for some reason, and you're leaking blood. So that makes sense. You're going to lose blood that way. Insufficient functional hemoglobin. So either you can't make the protein portions of the hemoglobin properly, a lot of times that's due to a dietary deficiency, or iron. An iron deficiency in your diet. You've got to have those irons in the heme groups that are present in the hemoglobins in order to bind the O2. So an iron, you guys know iron deficiency causes problems with with anemia. And like I was just mentioning, if you move to a higher altitude from a lower altitude, you're not adapted to that situation yet. And one of the ways that your body has to adapt is by cranking out more red blood cells to help capture more O2 from the lungs, so that can be transported to your tissues. More specifically, what are the targets of EPO? It's not so much that it tells the hemocytoblasts, hey, crank out more red blood cells. It's that it speeds up those committed bone marrow cells, the ones that are already committed to moving down the red blood cell pathway. Speed it up, crank out red blood cells faster so we can increase the population. It takes about 1 to 2 days to actually work. And as I was mentioning, there are athletes who abuse EPO. Erythropoietin can be given artificially as a drug. Testosterone, the male sex hormone, enhances EPO production, so the kidneys and the liver will crank out more of it in a male than they will in a female, and that's considered to be one of the main reasons why males have higher red blood cell counts. And as we've talked about before, that's one of the key reasons why males in general are able to do things like run for longer periods of time, or run faster, or lift heavier weights, those types of things, because more oxygen gas gets delivered to their skeletal muscles because of the increased number of red blood cells that they have compared to the average female. It's one of those gender differences. All right, what do we need in terms of dietary requirements for good erythropoiesis? And obviously, good erythropoiesis is something that's very important for your health. You got to have a good diet, good nutrients, and that includes amino acids, of course. You need those to build your proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, these general nutrients, red blood cells. You're cranking out millions per second. Red blood cells have cell membranes, just like other cells in your body. What are cell membranes built from? Phospholipids. And then all cells need carbohydrates for energy and other functions as well. So that makes sense. Iron, absolutely critical for hemoglobin. We take it in from our diet, but your body is pretty good at storing iron as well. It's stored in proteins called ferritin. And there's another one called hemosiderin as well. And so basically what happens is iron that comes in from your diet is captured by these proteins like ferritin, and it free iron just floating around in your body fluids could actually be toxic. So it helps capture and save that iron for mainly for making hemoglobin. That's one of its main uses in the body, or its key use in the body. Also, interestingly enough, when you guys take microbiology, you will learn that if you become infected, like you have a bacterial infection, bacteria need iron as well. And so since we store iron inside these proteins like ferritin that capture it, that helps hide iron from bacteria that enter the body. Now, obviously, that doesn't prevent bacteria from growing completely, but it may be one of the things that helps limit their growth. In your blood, iron is actually attached to a protein when it's just being transported around. It's attached to a protein called transferrin that's shuttling it from one place to another. Well, that's different from when iron is part of heme inside hemoglobin. Okay, other things you need in your diet. You've probably heard of these before. Vitamin B12 and folic acid are both needed for DNA synthesis. Folic acid, where have you heard folic acid before? Pregnant women often, or if not almost always in our country, take folic acid supplements, and that is a vitamin that is required for DNA synthesis. Guess when DNA synthesis is taking place? When cells are dividing. Guess what's going on in your bone marrow? Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of cell division as you wind up cranking out all of these different types of red blood cells. Vitamin B12 as well is needed for those processes. Those two vitamins are used by enzymes that are important for the DNA replication processes. All right, so what happens to our poor little red blood cells? They last about 100 to 120 days. That's a pretty long period of time. Shuttling oxygen gas from your lungs out to your tissues. They do not make any new proteins themselves. They don't grow, they don't divide. So once they become an erythrocyte, they're basically just a bag of hemoglobin floating around in your bloodstream. Now, over time, these red blood cells, just like anything else, they get damaged, they become fragile, they wear out. Your hemoglobin as well. There are little minor chemical reactions that take place all the time within your body, and over time, those little minor chemical reactions are gradually changing your important molecules like hemoglobin. So all of your important molecules like proteins and so forth don't last forever. They age or break down just like we do as a whole individual. So you got to replace these old red blood cells with their old and worn out hemoglobin that's not really working anymore. So eventually they get trapped in smaller blood-filled spaces, especially in the spleen. This is your spleen's one of its main jobs is to capture. There are tissues. This is supposed to be a cross-section here through the spleen. There are spaces inside the spleen which where blood flows through these compartments, and there are macrophages in there. If you guys remember, macrophages are kind of like the vacuum cleaners of your body. They are cells that do phagocytosis. They ingest things like bacteria and viruses, but also your old worn out cells and tissues that need to be broken down. That's basically their job. They're like the vacuum cleaners of the body. So macrophages in the spleen engulf these old worn out red blood cells and break them down. So you might be wondering, well, what if I lost my spleen? You've heard of people who've had their spleen taken out before. If you have your spleen taken out, your liver will take over for the spleen because you also have macrophages in your liver, and the liver also filters the blood very much like the spleen does, and so your liver basically will take over with that function if you wind up losing your spleen for some reason. All right, this is a pretty good little diagram from your, but I like this diagram because it shows you how your body is recycling all of these critical components from your red blood cells that have to be, you know, that wear out after just 100 to 120 days. And the main goal here is, you know, we really need to recycle the hemoglobin. And so these are the things that are happening when your macrophages ingest these old, worn out red blood cells or erythrocytes. And again, once you remove the water, the majority of what you have inside those red blood cells is hemoglobin. So the hemes and the globin proteins of the hemoglobin are first separated from each other. And then the iron portion of the heme is recaptured so that your body can reuse it. Iron is very critical. And you just don't take in enough from your diet to allow you to shed iron all the time. Your body needs to reuse this iron. And iron is not really something that's going to wear out like a big hemoglobin protein molecule would. Okay, the heme portion of hemoglobin undergoes some chemical reactions and becomes a yellow pigment called bilirubin. So that's derived from heme. Now you've seen that before. You know, if you get a bruise right underneath the skin, and sometimes it'll look yellow for a while before it clears up. What you're seeing there, when you have a bruise, blood vessels have broken near the surface of the skin, and macrophages come in, your body's vacuum cleaners, and start cleaning up all that damage that's located in there. And so by doing that, they're breaking down hemoglobin. You have a lot of hemoglobin in there, and you're seeing the hemes being converted over to that yellow pigment, bilirubin. That's why a bruise looks yellow for a while before it gets cleared up. The liver, so this bilirubin is floating around in your bloodstream, and the bilirubin goes to the liver. The liver takes that up and secretes it mainly into your intestines. Some of it gets converted into a pigment called urobilinogen. That's a yellowish pigment that actually ultimately winds up in your urine and helps give urine its color. And then bacteria in the intestinal tract take this bilirubin and actually convert it to a compound called stercobilin, which is something that actually gives your feces their beautiful color, believe it or not. So bacteria that live in your intestinal tract actually ultimately help break down the bilirubin, which came from the heme. All right, then what happens with the globin protein portions? Those get chopped up into their individual amino acids. Those amino acids go back into the bloodstream, and they get transported around, and other cells in your body can use those amino acids and take them up and use them for either energy or to start linking those amino acids together in chains to build the various types of proteins that your body needs. So your body's pretty good at doing some recycling here. All right, so that was kind of the broad overview of the erythrocyte story and their lifespan and how they wind up getting recycled. In the next lecture, we're actually going to talk about a pretty important topic here. We're going to talk about some erythrocyte disorders that you guys should be familiar with.